Hey, RetconRaider here. Today's video is dedicated to Mildly Nuclear, one of the regulars over on the official Phoenix Point Discord server. Thanks for your continued support, Nuke. That said, let's get started. Now, as many of you probably already know, the briefing number 5 came out on June 18th. That means that it's once again time for us to delve into the fascinating world of Phoenix Point as we take a closer look at the official new fiction. The briefing number 5 includes 2 reprinted stories and 6 entirely new stories written by Alan Stroud and Jonas Kairatsis. Clocking in at roughly 50 pages worth of new content, there's quite a lot to talk about. So, as usual, we'll be breaking it up into smaller bite-sized pieces to make it a little bit easier to digest. Much like the previous briefings, the stories collected in briefing number 5 are loosely themed around a specific faction, in this case, Synedrion. This is a faction that we've known very little about up until this point, beyond what we were told in the original crowdfunding campaign and the brief glimpse we got of their origin in stories like The Second Step and Towards Freedom. This all changes with briefing number 5, which gives us a much better idea of how the faction operates in the years leading up to the Third Mist. Like I said before, there's a lot to absorb here, so today we'll be starting off easy. We'll focus on the 2 new stories by Jonas Kairatsis, which give us a very good idea of what it's like to live in a Synedrion haven. But first, let's take a look at the shortest of the new stories, Ideology. This short, 1-page story serves as the introduction for the rest of the anthology. It's presented as the introductory remarks for a debate written by Elena Zeppa, a citizen from one of the Synedrion havens. Much like the introductions for the previous briefings, it's largely intended to help set the tone for the rest of the stories in the collection, but it's also intended to introduce us to the most basic premise of the Synedrion faction as a whole. In her writings, Citizen Zeppa muses over the strange dichotomy represented by Synedrion's ideology. On its face, the faction's ideology is focused on recognizing the current state of the world and striving to somehow change it into a more utopian one, ideally by finding some way to peacefully coexist with the Pandora virus. However, she notes that ideology requires an empirical understanding of reality. A lofty goal is meaningless if it's founded on an inherently flawed or misinterpreted premise. Even worse, without proper understanding, even an inherently altruistic ideology can become harmful, actively blinding people to the harsh realities of their situation. Citizen Zeppa notes that while Synedrion has many lofty principles, it was founded in a way that inherently violated many of them. She also notes that while the faction is built upon the ideals of personal freedom, individual expression, and competing points of view, the Pandora virus is a singular, unyielding, and uncompromising threat. She concludes her introductory statement by questioning Synedrion's current direction. Should humanity confront the harsh new reality that they find themselves in? Or are they really better served dreaming of a utopian future that may be impossible to actually obtain? This question is, of course, left unanswered, but it's something that's revisited in both of the stories we're looking at today. Let's start with Everything is So Much Worse Than You Thought It Was, by Jonas Kairatsis. This story focuses on the audio diary of a woman named Layla Alvarez, a citizen of an unidentified Synedrion haven. The diary identifies her as being 42 years old and a 14-year military veteran from Venezuela who is suffering from severe post-traumatic stress disorder. Though only a few details are given, her PTSD seems to stem from 2 particular incidents. The first was the fall of Caracas, when the Pandora virus overwhelmed the Venezuelan military during the Second Mist. The other incident is a bit more mysterious, involving the complete loss of her squad during something that's only referred to as Project WTF. As a result of this trauma, Layla suffered from recurring nightmares whenever she slept, as well as flashbacks and profuse sweating whenever she strayed too close to the perimeter of the haven she lived in. She also implied that her condition could cause her to go berserk in moments of extreme stress. Her psychologist, a survivor of the fall of Athens, suggested starting the audio diary to help her cope with what she had been through. While Layla initially approached the request with skepticism, she soon grew comfortable with the idea of recording her thoughts, not only discussing her trauma and how she was learning to deal with it, but also discussing her day-to-day life as a citizen. She described how she would read up on the latest debates, but never actually participate in them, and she expressed frustration with her increasingly awkward encounters with a love-struck biochemist named Kanmi. As a career soldier, she was used to the idea of simply taking orders and keeping her personal opinions to herself, which was at stark odds with Synedrion's philosophies of equality and personal expression. She was a creature of habit, of strict routine, being encouraged to express herself on a more regular basis, whether by trying new foods, meeting new people, or even participating in the regular debates. These were all things that she liked the sound of, but at the same time she was terrified of what it might represent. She feared that becoming too accustomed to this new way of life would mean becoming complacent, and cause her to forget the harsh realities of the Pandora virus that was perpetually lurking just outside the safety of the Haven. Thanks to her recurring nightmares, Layla still had vivid memories of how easily the Pandora virus had crushed the military forces in Caracas. While she acknowledged that Synedrion's technology was much more advanced than conventional military equipment, she also feared that Synedrion was putting too much faith in it. While the force fields did succeed in keeping the Pandora virus at bay, it also seemed to foster a false sense of security in much of the citizenry. Layla refused to allow herself to become too at ease with the Synedrion way of life, instead keeping herself busy during her recovery. She spent her free time at the community center, taking lessons on how to operate heavy machinery. At the urging of her psychiatrist, she also began helping with the cleanup around the Haven's perimeter, to help her ease into the idea of someday leaving the safety that the Haven represented. It was during one of these cleanup operations that she made a strange discovery. One of the mutated vines near the perimeter had begun working its way through the Haven's force field. While the other citizens were convinced that it was just the result of an equipment failure, Layla insisted on investigating, and soon discovered that the vine had evolved in a way that specifically allowed it to penetrate the field. This was an alarming discovery, which seemed to confirm all of Layla's worst fears. If she had grown complacent and simply accepted the easy explanation, then those vines could have potentially resulted in the destruction of the entire Haven. This ultimately made her realize that, in order to prevent similar disasters in the future, she would need to become more comfortable with the idea of taking on a more active role in her community. The story concludes with Layla embracing her role as a citizen, not only agreeing to go out on a date with Kanmi, but also participating in her first public debate. This brings the story full circle, as she speaks out to her fellow citizens about the dangers of complacency, warning them that everything is so much worse than they thought it was. This rolls quite neatly into our second story, It Ain't Over Till It's Over, Jackasses, also by Jonas Kairatsis. This story takes place shortly after the events of Everything is Worse, and is presented as the transcript of an argument put forward by Dr. Jacob Naidu during a public assembly in June of 2046. Inspired by Layla's warnings about complacency, Dr. Naidu decided to weigh in as well, essentially echoing Layla's argument, but with the added weight of his own past experiences. Decades earlier, he had attempted to warn government officials about the potentially apocalyptic threat posed by the first mist. While some of the people he had spoken with had acknowledged the potential dangers the mist represented, most had simply ignored his warnings. They steadfastly believed that no matter how bad the situation got, things would always return to normal, given enough time. They simply couldn't imagine that anything could ever completely destroy the status quo, and they felt that their time was better spent pursuing their own individual goals, rather than preparing for a disaster that might never take place. Even worse, Dr. Naidu recalled how humanity had simply refused to learn from their mistakes. Even after the First Mist and World War III had left much of the world in ruins, the remaining governments and corporations had still ignored the doctor's warnings about a second mist. Instead, they had remained focused on finding ways to personally profit from the rebuilding efforts, unwilling to imagine that things could ever get any worse than they already had. It was this sort of delusional complacency which had resulted in the disastrous fall of Athens and the complete collapse of the Grecian government. When the second mist finally came, the politicians were caught entirely unprepared. Panicking, they had herded civilians into ineffectual shelters to die, sent their military to fight a battle they couldn't possibly win, and hoarded all the most vital supplies for their own personal use. When Synedrion had intervened, evacuating citizens to their nearby haven on Mount Lycabettus, the government had responded by lashing out at them. In the end, their blind faith in the status quo and their inherently selfish behavior had doomed them, resulting in one final conflict that had left Synedrion's origins stained with blood. Dr. Nadu warned his peers that they were walking into the same trap that had doomed so many people before them. As Citizen Alvarez had so eloquently stated in her own argument, their haven was in danger of falling to complacency, placing so much faith in the new status quo that Synedrion had created that they were blinded to the realities of their situation. He cautioned his peers that they were becoming too obsessed with dreams of an ideal future, when there were more immediate threats to contend with. His warnings had been ignored during the first and second mist, and humanity had paid the price. Now he was convinced that there was a third mist on the way, and he feared that if Synedrion couldn't get it right this time, then that would mean the end of the human race. Now, it's interesting to note how both of these stories, and the introduction for that matter, all come to the same conclusion. The individual characters and specific details vary, but they all revolve around the same basic premise, that Synedrion is its own worst enemy. Synedrion is a faction dedicated towards achieving an ideal, utopian future, but which is also in danger of losing touch with the harsh reality of their current situation. Their technology has afforded them with safeties and luxuries that other factions can only dream about, but this has had the side effect of deluding them into a sense of false security. With the constant threat of the Pandora virus held at arm's length, Synedrion is in very real danger of falling victim to the same complacency that both Layla Alvarez and Dr. Jacob Nadu attempted to warn them about. While their stated goal is an admirable one, it's one that they set for themselves decades earlier, in the face of extreme adversity and the rising threat of the Pandora virus. It's a goal that they may have lost sight of, and one that may ultimately prove unattainable if the citizens of Synedrion ever grow so content with their new place in the world that they stop trying to find new ways to improve it. This is actually something Jonas Kairatsis has hinted at in the past. In briefing number 3, Lieutenant Daniel Stoller from the new Jericho faction essentially echoed the same point, stating that Synedrion's sheltered way of life had essentially blinded them to just how bad the rest of the world had become. Similarly, the unnamed protagonist from Before the Waters of Life in briefing number 4 also noted that the Synedrion representative they spoke with seemed oddly detached from reality. She had been visibly preoccupied with preparing for a meaningless philosophical debate, even while speaking with a potential recruit who was more concerned with the long-term survival of the human race. This all paints a rather vivid picture of Synedrion's most glaring flaws. They're easily the most advanced of the 4 main factions, and they claim to have the most altruistic goal, but they're also at severe risk of completely losing their direction. The simple nature of their organization, one which encourages debate and individual freedom of expression, with a complete lack of stable leadership, leaves them woefully unprepared for the impossibly ambitious goal that they've supposedly set for themselves. Much like Citizen Zeppa wrote in the introduction, Synedrion has always prided itself for its pluralism, but how will that fare against the singular, unrelenting reality of the Pandora virus? Again, that's a question we can't answer. Not yet, anyway. But I'm sure we'll find out when we finally get our hands on the finished game. Now, that's it for this video, but we've just barely scratched the surface where Synedrion is concerned. This batch of stories gave us a pretty good overview of the faction, but there's still a lot more to talk about. Next time, we'll be taking a second look at briefing number 5, including 2 more stories that might just cast the faction in a slightly more sinister light. But for now, this is RetconRaider, signing off. Thanks for listening. Oh, and remember, although I do love talking about Phoenix Point, you can find out more about the game by visiting the official website, the Facebook page, the YouTube page, the subreddit, the official Discord channel, or the original crowdfunding campaign over on Fig. Links are in the description.